catch the enemy before he's in position to attack. Catch them when they're taking off, or when they're climbing, or when they're forming up. Don't think you can defend a bomber by circling around it. It's good for the bomber's morale and bad for tactics.
Take 1,000 bombers, a bomber stream of 1,000. That's a lot of land up in the air to try to cover. And they're going to get in there some way or another and got a few of those. So we couldn't cover them all the time, but we did a pretty good job. Without the Mustang, it would have been pretty bad.
Throughout the war, fighter pilots were glamorous figures, standing out as individuals in a striking contrast to the anonymous scale of modern warfare. They captured the public imagination. They seemed like knights of old, jousting in the sky. Most nations had their aces, pilots with a special flair for shooting down the enemy.
I got a Messerschmitt 109 in the door. How'd you get on, sir? 109.
Scores of German aces had over 100 victories to their credit.
Von vorne an. Ich hatte gerade den rechts außen fliegen und vor mir aus ca. 200 Meter Entfernung.
Air forces were quick to exploit their achievements, turning them into heroes to raise morale at home.
There's one ingredient that I think you can always spot in an ace. He's usually a very light-hearted type of fellow. He likes a lot of fun. Good drinker, usually. Chaser. He takes things very lightly, but there's something else that you don't see in his dedication.
There was very little arrogance about it. There was a certain amount of humility.
Blue section out there.
We were all extremely proud to be in the position we were. There was the odd individual who had so little between the ears that he thought that nothing on earth could ever defeat him, and they didn't normally last.
Please understand, aerial combat is not a set piece. Two men pitting themselves, one against the other, and the best man wins. Aerial combat is often surprise, hit, slash, run. You engage, you fire, you look around, and the sky is empty. It's that fast. Where did everyone go?
1 minute, a crazy business with lots of aircraft in the sky. A few seconds later, you couldn't see an aircraft anywhere. This is the most eerie thing about dogfighting.
All the plans that had been laid were destroyed, and everyone was down here or over here or going back. It was chaos, of course, but orderly chaos.
When you actually fire, the aircraft tries to buck around like a horse because the recoil from 8 guns is quite considerable. I was shot up many a time. And the strange thing is, in the air, you can smell cordite or hot lead. And it's the most unpleasant smell, particularly when you're flying something full of high-octane fuel.
It's a catch-22. You can't teach it unless you've been there. If you haven't been there, you can't learn it. And the point that cannot be trained is that in the first couple of seconds of one of those engagements, somebody dies. very difficult for the inexperienced pilot to accept. You sense very quickly in an engagement the ability of your opponent. He was a new kid. You almost felt sorry for him, or he was an old head. And the 109 in an experienced pilot's hand was a very formidable adversary.
Well, the first kill was an FW-190. I just pulled it a little tighter and put my sights about 10 degrees beyond the nose and hit him right in the cockpit. And he just kind of rolled over and went in. Well, whether that scene was not as delightful as I thought it would be, and I wanted to get away from what I'd done. I've often thought about that. But I was very excited about it, and I was very proud.
But fighters had other key roles besides air combat. Attacking the enemy on the ground was one, both his frontline troops and his communications. So specialist aircraft were developed, like the RAF's Typhoon.
If we had been able to be quite effective with our Hurricanes in attacking ground targets with machine guns, then we ought to be very, very much more effective with a much faster aeroplane with 4 whacking great cannon, which we had on the Typhoon. And so it proved to be. For a start, it was 100 miles an hour faster than a Hurricane, which was a jolly good thing to be at that time. You weren't going to get anywhere in air warfare in an aeroplane that was much slower than the enemy. But it had a limitation in terms of its ability above 20,000 feet. It was very fast, lower altitude. It had a higher diving speed than any other airplane that I knew of at the time on either side. It was a very accurate weapon for attacking pinpoint targets. It could accept quite a lot of flak damage and survive. And the Typhoon could live in a hostile environment at low level.
Flying ground attack fighters is less glamorous than air combat, but more dangerous.
It was personal. Strafing a truck, bombing a railroad yard, trying to bomb a bridge. Very personal. You were right in the front line. Down to earth, we called it. Tremendous satisfaction in blowing up a goods wagon, sinking a barge full of petrol, strafing an airfield. All highly dangerous, but there's a certain satisfaction in destroying something. War's not supposed to be fun, but if you can imagine seeing a railroad train going down the track and there's a steam engine out in front just dying to be shot. And when you shoot it, a great cloud of steam comes out the sides and up through the smokestack. The train shudders to a halt. Oh, you're filled with joy.
Fighter bombers like the Typhoon and Thunderbolt added a fresh horror to war's grim catalog, destroying the enemy whenever he tried to move in daylight. By 1944, the German armies were in retreat. Their airfields lost in the Allied advances or destroyed by the onslaught from the air, the Luftwaffe operated from forest clearings or highways. The losses were colossal. Over 500 aircraft a week. Starved of fuel, short of trained pilots, they flung everything they had into the air to check the Allied offensive. New aircraft were developed in the search for a wonder weapon that could turn the tide. Among the strangest the Germans experimented with was the Dornier 335.
Es war ein Flugzeug, was vorn und hinten.
It was a plane that had in front the pulling propeller, at the rear the pushing propeller. Each engine achieved 1,750 horsepower. With 3,500 horsepower, it was not an exactly underpowered plane. Amongst other things, what was perhaps interesting was that it had a gear change diagonally under the steering. As one flew faster, the rudder movements became smaller and thus well measured. I actually enjoyed flying the DO-335 very much. I very quickly got used to it. I was perfectly happy with it. As in respect to speed, it almost reached that of the jet planes.
Even more spectacular was the rocket-powered Messerschmitt 163, the Comet. It had a speed of 600 miles an hour and a phenomenal rate of climb. Few, though, saw combat. Most formidable of all these pioneering achievements was the Messerschmitt 262. It was the world's first jet fighter to see action, but came too late to save the Luftwaffe. By 1944, the British had their own jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, though it was never used against enemy aircraft. The arrival of these two jets in the European skies swept in a new era of flight. Six years later, in the Korean War, jet fighters did clash in air combat. Many of the American pilots were veterans of World War II, well-trained and battle-hardened. Their principal weapon was the newly introduced F-86 Sabre. In it, they achieved almost undisputed dominance of the skies over Korea. By the end of the war, Sabres had claimed nearly 800 enemy aircraft destroyed for the loss of 78 of their own.
The transition from piston-driven, propeller-driven aircraft to jet-propelled aircraft was not as traumatic a change as one might imagine. Flying at altitude to conserve fuel was a change. The speeds weren't all that violent, because speed is relative. If he's going 600, you're going 600, what's the difference? Zero. I was in the first fighter group that had the first 35 production models of the F-86A-1. We wrecked over 20 of them. It wasn't all our fault. They just weren't built well. There was a new step forward. Pieces kept flying off, engines quit, tails would go fluttering. It was really a wild ride. It was very seldom that you took off without landing under emergency conditions.
The opposition was principally the Chinese, with some Soviet volunteers. The communist pilots were no match in skill and experience for their American and Allied opponents. But their aircraft, the Soviet-built MiG-15, was a revelation. An excellent fighter powered, ironically, by an engine based on a Rolls-Royce design. It outperformed all the American fighters except the Sabre, and in some features was superior to that as well. Its appearance sent a shockwave through the West. The scene was set for history's first jet fighter combats.
We took the fourth group over first, which were F-86s out of Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. It was wintertime, that's terribly cold in Korea, and you couldna damn thing started. So we finally worked out, but we flew under very difficult conditions.
The 86 was a good dogfight machine. It was like a P-51, but it was much faster. Good visibility, rugged, reliable. The later models didn't fly apart. The time span between the two wars was not great enough for us to have lost the knowledge that had been gained.
The MiG pilots make the same mistakes that the Germans used to make, and that is head for the deck. And we could out-accelerate them in the F-86s. But the MiG-15 could out-climb the F-86. It was a lot of airplane. At first, you stand back and shoot, and you could knock them down. The MiG was a very tough airplane. See, the metals had gotten stronger because of the speeds of airplanes had increased. So then they finally got some heavier guns in the 86s. and started getting the victories.
The Russians, like America and her allies, used Korea as a proving ground where their pilots could gain experience of the new shape of aerial warfare. The use of air power in Korea stimulated a highly comprehensive program of technical innovation and aircraft development between the superpowers. The MiG-15 jet fighter fathered a whole family of MiGs, each one more sophisticated than the last, equal and sometimes superior to the performance of the new fighter planes of the West. Before long, the Soviet Union had one of the biggest and most up-to-date air forces in the world, and supplied a host of nations with its aircraft. Since Korea, pilots of the superpowers have never again met in combat. But the Cold War that followed created a different kind of confrontation between the air forces of the two opposing alliances. To this day, the air crews of both sides keep up a constant vigil, tracking every move the other makes. Airborne warning systems have become an essential part of the armory. Aircraft packed with electronic surveillance equipment search for signs of a surprise attack. Few skies are potentially more dangerous than the airspace over Europe, where the powers of NATO and the Warsaw Pact share a frontier. So when an unidentified airplane appears on the radar screen, fighters are sent up to investigate and intercept the intruder. These days, tension has eased between the superpowers. So this confrontation between Soviet bomber and the RAF Tornado ends with a friendly wave. Elsewhere, fighters have had bloodier battles. June the 5th, 1967. Around 300 Israeli aircraft, mainly French-built fighter bombers, prepare to launch the most decisive airstrike in history. Their target? The air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. However sweet the victory, for the pilots, it remains an impersonal experience.
Only thing that you hear is a lot of noise that comes from your earphones, the commanding of the whole controlling net that are in the air. You don't hear the shooting. Maybe you can hear your shooting, your strafing of your cannon, but you don't hear the hits. You don't hear the shouts. You don't see the face and you don't see the blood of the enemy in front of you.
In just 2 days, the air war is over. In a few devastating hours, the Israelis have disabled all but one of the Arab airfields, destroying 393 aircraft on the ground and shooting down 23. With total command of the skies, Israeli fighters can now give tactical support to their soldiers as they advance across the desert. Then, in another annihilating strike, they catch the Egyptian army in the Mitla Pass and leave it in ruins.
I flew over it. It was very sad, looking down and seeing remains of burnt-out vehicles, thousands, literally thousands of vehicles that were not going to go anywhere anymore. It looked like an enormous scrapyard.
In all its years of combat, it is the jet fighter's most impressive victory. In Vietnam, the air war was very different.
Okay, we got you inside. Okay, keep me inside now. I'll go up here and I'll mark the target when you're ready.
Here, the United States was up against a guerrilla army, concealed in the Vietnamese jungles, hard to find and harder to hurt.
Looks pretty good. I'd like you to keep your passes as steep as possible and be
The main role for the fighters was ground attack, launching airstrikes against enemy positions. The American fighters were fast, electronically sophisticated, and delivered a formidable punch, but they were not designed to fight a guerrilla war. When fighters attacked targets in the north, they met a more conventional enemy, North Vietnamese MiGs.
You only had missiles, so you had to maneuver to get yourself into missile firing position. No snap shooting. Fast, slashing, quick action, and then gone. Their pilots, damn good. Very good. They were very aggressive. They knew what they were doing. They flew with good discipline. I have great respect for them.
Most versatile of the American fighters was the Phantom. It was the workhorse of Navy and Air Force, equally good at air combat or on a bombing run.
The Smoke and Thunderhawk F-4 is one of the finest airplanes in the world. You know, an airplane is like your wife. She has her good points, her bad points. You love the good ones and you learn to live with the bad ones. The F-4 has got a lot of good points. And if I had my choice of flying a MiG-17, a MiG-19, or a MiG-21, I would rather fly the Phantom. She has 17,900 pounds of thrust per engine. Very reliable. It turns like a truck. She won't outturn a MiG, but you know the good points of your weapon system that outperforms and outclimbs the enemy. So you go vertical. Now, he can't go vertical with you.
I would have to say that the missile was the most frightening aspect. Flak is flak. They had more